A violent snowstorm closes the mountain highway. Power lines fail. Hotels are full. Ethan hears desperate knocking on his cabin door just before midnight. When he opens it, a soaked woman stands there shivering. She looks over her shoulder into the darkness, then quietly says, "Please don't ask questions." A pause. "For tonight, you're my husband." Before Ethan can answer, headlights appear through the snow. "My name is Ethan. I was 36 years old that winter, and if you'd asked anybody in town what I did with my days, they'd have told you the same thing. I fixed boats. I fixed docks. I kept to myself. I used to be a rescue swimmer for the Coast Guard. 6 years of jumping out of helicopters into water that wanted to kill me. Then I came home to the mountains, to a lake that freezes over every November, and I started fixing what other people broke, instead of pulling people out of the sea. Smaller stakes, quieter work. That was the idea, anyway. My mornings never changed. I'd wake up before the sun, let my old dog Duke out into the cold, and stand on the porch with a cup of coffee while my breath fogged up in front of me. Then I'd load the wood stove, drink my coffee slow, and go to work. Same routine, every day, for 3 years. People in town used to invite me to things, dinners, fish fries, a Christmas party or two. I always found a reason to say no. After a while, they stopped asking. I told myself I liked it that way. I hadn't always been a man who lived alone. 3 years earlier, I had a wife. Her name was Rachel, and she was driving home from her sister's house during a snowstorm, on a road I'd driven 1,000 times myself, and she never made it. That's the whole story, really. A patch of ice, a guardrail, a phone call I still remember every word of. I wasn't in the car. I was home, waiting on her. Same as I waited on everybody after that, just waiting on people who weren't coming back. So I built a life that didn't ask much of me. A dog, a stove, a lake full of other people's boats. It wasn't happiness, but it didn't hurt either. Most days, that felt like enough. Then came the night everything changed. That night started out like every other night that winter. By 9 o'clock, I'd banked the stove and let Duke out for his last round of the yard, same as always. I remember thinking the wind sounded different, sharper, meaner, like it was working up to something. I didn't know how right I was. The knock came 20 minutes later. I've already told you what happened next. The door, the woman standing there, the 5 words that turned my ordinary night inside out. What I haven't told you is what came after. Up close, in the lamplight, I could see what the porch dark had hidden. A torn hem on an evening dress. One heel snapped clean off. A thin gold bracelet hanging loose on her wrist, like it had been yanked at hard enough to slide the clasp. Whatever she'd come from, it wasn't a walk in the snow. It was a wedding, or something close to one, and she'd left it running. Duke didn't bark at her. That told me something too. He just walked over, sat down against her leg, and leaned his whole weight into her, like he already understood something I didn't. "Are you hurt?" I asked her. It was the only question that made sense. She shook her head, though her hands were shaking hard enough that I didn't fully believe her. I already told you what she asked of me next. What I haven't told you is what I felt when she said it. Not fear, not confusion, though I probably should have felt both. What I felt was something closer to recognition, like some door in me that had been shut for 3 years creaked open half an inch, just enough to let her through. I didn't answer her with words. I just nodded, once, the way a man agrees to something he doesn't understand yet, but knows he's going to see through anyway. That's when the headlights showed up. I caught the sound before I saw the light. Tires crunching slow through packed snow, an engine idling low, the kind of slow roll that told you somebody wasn't driving past. They were looking. I killed the kitchen lamp without thinking about it. Her hand found my arm in the dark and held on so tight I felt her nails through my flannel. We stood at that window together, 2 strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder, watching a black SUV crawl along my fence line like it was reading the house. I put my arm around her without deciding to. It just happened, the way your body remembers things your mind hasn't caught up to yet. The SUV idled at the end of my drive for what felt like a full minute. Then, slow as it came, it rolled on, taillights swallowed by the snow. She didn't move for a long time after that. When she finally did, it was to pull back just far enough to look at me. Really look. Like she was deciding whether to trust a man she'd known for all of 10 minutes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," I told her. "Come sit by the fire before you catch your death." I still didn't know her name. I got her a towel and a set of Rachel's old clothes I'd never had the heart to give away. I didn't think about that until later. How strange it was, watching a stranger wear my dead wife's sweater. She didn't ask whose it was. Maybe she guessed. I put a pot of soup on the stove because it was the only thing I knew how to do with my hands that wasn't fixing something. We didn't talk much while it cooked, just small things. "Claire," she said finally when I asked. "My name is Claire." "Ethan," I told her. That was as far as it went. 2 names, exchanged quiet as a secret, in a kitchen that smelled like snow and wood smoke and tomato soup. We were still strangers. I want you to understand that. Nothing about that night was the beginning of anything. Not yet. It was just 2 people trying to get through a storm. While I stirred the pot, I caught her looking at a photograph on my shelf. Rachel and me, taken years back before any of this. Claire didn't ask who she was. She just looked at it a long moment, the way you look at something you understand without being told. And then she looked away, like she was giving me my privacy back. I noticed something too. When she reached for the mug of coffee I handed her, her sleeve slid up just enough for me to see bruising around her wrist, the kind that comes from somebody gripping too hard, too many times. I didn't say anything. Some things you don't ask a stranger on the worst night of her life. You just notice, and you file it away, and you decide, quietly, that whatever happens next, you're not going to be the second man who hurts her. We ate our soup by the fire. Duik laid his head across her feet like he'd known her for years instead of an hour. Outside, the wind kept trying to get in. After a while, Claire set her spoon down and looked at me with something like shame. "I'm sorry I involved you," she said. "Before I tell you what happened the next morning, tell me where you're watching from tonight." I read every comment, and if you're enjoying this story, subscribe to Honeywood Stories. You belong here. I didn't have an answer for her apology. I was still turning it over in my mind when she looked toward the window, toward the dark road where those headlights had disappeared, and said the words that told me this storm was far from over. They'll probably be back before sunrise. Claire couldn't sleep. She sat on the floor beside the dying fireplace, knees pulled to her chest, watching the last orange embers fight to stay alive. The cabin ticked and settled around her, unfamiliar sounds in an unfamiliar life. She didn't hear Ethan wake. She only noticed when Duke's tail thumped once against the floorboards, and then Ethan was there, quiet in his socked feet, lowering himself down a careful distance away. Neither of them said anything. Snow hammered the windows in soft, relentless waves. Duke stretched out between them, a warm line of fur and steady breathing, as if he'd appointed himself the bridge. Ethan reached for another log without being asked and set it on the coals. Sparks lifted, caught, held. The fire took new light. For a long moment the only sound was the wood settling into flame. It was the first silence all day that didn't feel like it needed filling. Dawn was supposed to come quietly, the way it always did in the mountains. Pale light easing over the ridge, snow gone blue then gold. Instead, the storm got worse. By 7, the county had closed the roads. By 8, Claire's phone had no bars at all, just a small red exclamation mark that felt like a verdict. By 9, the lights flickered twice and went out for good. Ethan didn't panic. He moved through the cabin like he'd rehearsed this exact morning 100 times, striking a match, lighting the oil lanterns one by one until the room glowed amber instead of gray. Claire stood at the window, watching the world disappear into white. She understood, with a small drop in her stomach, that she wasn't leaving today either. They were no longer pretending for one night. They were trapped together. The wood stove ticked and popped as Ethan cracked eggs into a blackened pan. Toast leaned against the stove's warm side, browning slowly. "Let me help," Claire said, reaching for the spatula before he could argue. 2 minutes later, half the eggs were stuck to the pan, and the other half were somehow already burnt. "In my defense," she said, staring at the wreckage, "nobody told me eggs could do that." Ethan looked at the pan, then at her. A smile broke across his face, unguarded, surprised at itself, the first one that had reached his eyes in longer than he could remember. Duke seized the moment and stole a strip of bacon straight off the counter, trotting off with the guiltless confidence of a dog who knew he wouldn't be chased. Claire laughed. Ethan laughed too. For just a moment, the tension that had followed them since the courthouse thawed like the frost on the window glass. Later, over lukewarm coffee, Claire finally let it out. She told him about Victor slowly, the way someone testing thin ice, feeling for a spot to put weight. She had been engaged to him once, years ago. She had ended it herself, before the wedding, before it became a mistake she couldn't undo. "He never hit me," she said. "He never even raised his voice." Ethan waited. He just never left. He was always so polite about it, so reasonable. She turned her mug in slow circles on the table. He'd show up wherever I was and smile and say he only wanted to talk, and everyone around me thought I was lucky to have someone so devoted. "Nobody believed you," Ethan said. "It wasn't a question. How could they? He never did anything you could point to." Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. "He just made himself impossible to get rid of." The fire popped. Claire looked at her hands instead of at him. "I wasn't looking for a husband," she said finally. A pause stretched long enough that Duke lifted his head to check on them. "I was looking for the first kind face I saw." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. There wasn't a version of an answer that wouldn't sound too small for what she'd just handed him. So he said nothing at all, and let the quiet stand in for everything he didn't have words for yet. Claire's eyes drifted, not for the first time, to the photograph on the mantel. A young woman laughing in a wedding dress, sunlight caught in her hair. She didn't ask this time. She just said, softly, "She must have been special." Ethan was quiet for a while. Then he told her about Rachel. Not the version with the sharp edges he usually kept locked away, but the plain, unornamented truth of it. How they'd built this cabin together, board by board. How the sweater on the hook by the door had been hers. How some mornings, 4 years later, he still made 2 cups of coffee before he remembered. There was no performance in it. No collapse, either. Just a man finally saying a name out loud to someone who hadn't asked him to. _ Have you ever met someone who made you feel safe without saying very much? Tell me below. We never judge here. _ The storm eased just enough to let them outside. They shoveled the porch together, breath fogging the air, Ethan tossing snow in wide, practiced arcs, while Claire's pile grew crooked and uneven beside his. Later he knelt over the generator in the shed, muttering at a stubborn bolt, and she crouched beside him without being asked, handing him tools before he even reached for them. 10 mil, he said. She was already holding it out. He glanced at her, surprised, and she just shrugged. "I've been paying attention." Neither of them said what it felt like. They didn't have to. 2 people moving around each other like they'd done it for years, not days, was its own kind of sentence. That evening, Claire changed back into her own clothes and carefully folded Rachel's sweater along its old creases, smoothing the sleeves flat before setting it on the bed. "I'll wash it before I leave," she said. Ethan stood in the doorway a moment. "You don't have to." She looked at the sweater, then at him, and didn't ask what he meant by that. But she held on to it a second longer than she needed to, before she set it down. The black SUV came back the next afternoon, gliding up the newly plowed drive like it had never been stopped by the storm at all. Victor knocked with the same easy confidence he did everything. Perfect coat, perfect smile, nothing about him that would ever show up wrong in a photograph. "Claire," he said warmly, as if greeting an old friend. "Everyone's worried." Claire didn't hesitate. She stepped up beside Ethan and slid her hand into his, fingers lacing through his, like they'd done it every day of their lives. "My husband and I are fine," she said, calm and clear. Victor's smile didn't move, but his eyes did. The SUV pulled away, tires hissing over packed snow until the sound faded into the trees. Claire watched it go from the porch, arms crossed against the cold. "The roads will open tomorrow," she said quietly. A long silence followed, broken only by the wind combing through the pines. Then, so soft he almost missed it, "Would you still pretend just one more day?" The roads reopened just after sunrise, plows carving fresh black lines through the white. Ethan's truck bumped along behind them, chains rattling softly on the tires, the cabin shrinking to a speck in the rearview mirror before the trees swallowed it entirely. The drive to the mountain lodge wound past frozen lakes and pine trees still wearing their storm coats. The whole valley scrubbed clean and glittering under a hard blue sky. Sunlight caught the snow in a way that made it look lit from underneath. Neither of them said much. There wasn't a version of small talk that fit what waited at the other end of the road, and both of them seemed to know it, content instead to watch the scenery slide by and let the silence do the talking. Claire kept glancing at her hands in her lap. Ethan kept glancing at her. Claire's family met them in the lodge's great room, all vaulted beams and roaring hearths, and the shock on their faces was immediate and unguarded. Nobody had known she was married, Not one phone call, not one warning, not so much as a hint dropped at Sunday dinner. Questions came fast. When? How? Why didn't you tell us? Who is he? Layered over each other until they blurred into noise. Claire answered each one calmly, her voice even, her hand never leaving Ethan's arm, like an anchor she'd decided to trust before she'd fully earned the right to lean on it. It happened quickly, she said, more than once. It wasn't quite a lie. It also wasn't quite the truth, and she felt the weight of that gap every time she said it. Her younger sister hugged her twice, delighted and disbelieving in the same breath, already peppering Ethan with questions about how they'd met, whether it had been romantic, whether Claire had cried. Her older brother hung back near the fireplace, arms crossed, studying Ethan the way a man studies a used car he doesn't quite trust, checking for rust under the paint. Her mother said very little at first, just watched, quiet and thorough. Ethan's boots, still faintly salted from the mountain roads, his hands, rough in a way that spoke of real work. The careful way he stood half a step behind Claire without ever really leaving her side, close enough to matter, far enough not to crowd. Ethan had felt out of place in plenty of rooms in his life. Job sites, hospital waiting rooms, his own kitchen in the years right after Rachel. He'd never felt it quite like this, dressed in a borrowed sport coat, surrounded by chandeliers and a family sizing him up like a verdict not yet delivered. Victor arrived exactly on time, in a suit that fit like it had been considered from every angle. He crossed the room straight to Ethan, hand extended, smile wide. "Congratulations," he said warmly, gripping Ethan's hand a beat too long. "Truly, she deserves to be happy." Everyone within earshot saw a gracious man being generous to his replacement. Only Claire, watching from 3 feet away, saw exactly what it was. Dinner ran long, crystal and candlelight, and too many courses, the kind of meal where every plate looked more like a decoration than food. Victor sat across the table, effortlessly charming, refilling glasses and laughing at exactly the right moments, and slid in questions like knives wrapped in tissue paper. "So, boats," he said, swirling his wine, watching Ethan over the rim of the glass. "That's interesting. Steady work? Reliable," Ethan said. "Good, good. Stability matters." Victor smiled at the table, drawing the others in without ever raising his voice. Not everyone gets to choose a career for the view. A ripple of polite laughter went around the table. No single sentence was an insult. Together they added up to one anyway. Each remark a small stone dropped in the same spot until the ground gave way. Claire's jaw tightened. She said nothing out loud, but her hand found Ethan's under the tablecloth and stayed there, her thumb tracing slow, steady circles against his knuckles, a silent apology for a room he hadn't chosen to be judged in. Later, when the band eased into something slow, Claire surprised herself by standing, smoothing her dress before she could talk herself out of it. "I haven't danced since." She stopped, then decided not to finish that sentence. "Since a long time ago. I should warn you," Ethan said, holding out his hand anyway. "I'm bad at this." He wasn't exaggerating. He stepped on her foot within the first 8 bars, apologizing so quickly and so genuinely that she started laughing before she could stop herself. "You're doing it on purpose," she accused, gripping his shoulder for balance. "I promise you I am not." He stepped on her foot again, wincing at himself before she even had the chance to. She laughed harder, loud enough that a few heads turned across the ballroom, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, it didn't matter who was watching. It was the kind of laugh that came from somewhere she'd forgotten she still had. Near the edge of the dance floor, Claire's mother found Ethan alone for a moment, while Claire went to get water. "I haven't seen her smile like that," she said, watching her daughter across the room, "in a very long time." Ethan didn't know what answer that deserved, so he offered none. He just nodded, and her mother studied him a moment longer before walking away, something in her expression softer than it had been an hour ago. Victor caught Ethan alone by the bar, all warmth dropped now that no one else was close enough to hear, his smile gone flat and businesslike. "You don't belong in her world," he said quietly. Not a threat. Worse, a fact, stated the way you'd state a fact, like he was doing Ethan the courtesy of honesty for once. Ethan didn't flinch. He turned the glass slowly in his hand before answering. "Maybe not." He set the glass down on the bar, unhurried. "But she asked me to stand beside her." He held Victor's gaze a moment longer than was comfortable. then walked away before Victor could find a smile to put back on. Behind him, he heard nothing. No comeback, no laugh, which told him more than any words could have. Near the end of the night, Victor did something bold enough to be unmistakable. He crossed the ballroom floor and asked Claire, in front of the entire reception, for one last conversation, alone. His voice carried just enough for the nearest tables to hear, calculated to leave her no graceful way to refuse without a scene. The room went quiet in that particular way rooms do when everyone is pretending not to listen. Glasses paused halfway to lips, conversations trailing off mid-sentence. Claire walked toward him. For one breath, even Ethan wasn't sure what would happen, his chest tight in a way he didn't examine too closely. Then she walked past Victor entirely, not a glance back, not a hesitation, crossed the floor, and stopped beside Ethan. She took his hand in front of everyone, fingers threading through his the same way they had on the cabin porch. Not because she was frightened of what Victor might do, because that was simply where she wanted to be. Ethan looked down at her, and whatever he meant to say dissolved before it reached his mouth. He kissed her instead, gently, like a question that had already been answered. The room was full of people, and somehow it felt like the most private moment either of them had had in years. No one cheered, no one clapped. The silence said more than applause ever could have. That night, long after the lodge had gone quiet, Ethan packed his truck in the dark. He told himself it was practical. Her family had accepted her. She was safe. Victor had shown his hand and lost. The job, if that's still what it had ever been, was finished. He told himself a lot of things that night. He didn't believe most of them. He packed anyway. Claire woke to gray morning light and an unfamiliar quiet. On the kitchen table sat a single key, the cabin's, set down carefully, deliberately, like something being returned rather than left behind. Outside, the space where his truck had been, was just clean, undisturbed snow. Ethan drove home in the dark, headlights carving two narrow tunnels through the trees, telling himself the same story he'd told himself all night, that Claire deserved a life without complications, without a man who fixed boats for a living and flinched at fancy dinners and didn't know which fork to use. That leaving quietly, before anyone had to ask him to, was its own kind of gift, the kind of thing a decent man did. The road blurred past, mile after identical mile of snow-heavy pine. None of it made him feel better. By the time the cabin's dark shape rose up ahead of him, he almost didn't want to go inside it. Hours later, Claire's car crunched up the drive through fresh snow, following the only tracks that led back to the cabin. His tracks, laid down hours before hers. She found him on the dock, kneeling over a warped board, hammer in hand, working with the kind of focus a man uses when he's trying very hard not to think about something else. He didn't look up even though he must have heard her car, her footsteps on the frozen planks, the small sound she made when she stopped a few feet behind him. "You keep deciding what's best for me," she said, standing at the edge of the dock, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. He didn't answer right away. The hammer tapped once, twice, against the board, buying him time he didn't really need. "You never asked me," she said, quieter now, the anger gone out of it, leaving something more fragile in its place. The hammer stilled in his hand. He set it down slowly on the weathered wood, and finally looked at her, and there was nothing left to perform for either of them. No audience, no Victor, no family watching from across a crowded room. Just the two of them, the frozen lake stretching out behind her, and the truth, which had been waiting patiently for both of them to stop running from it. "I didn't think I had the right," he said, "to ask you to choose a life like this one. That wasn't yours to decide." He nodded slowly. She was right, and he knew it. She held the sweater out to him, washed and pressed, folded exactly the way he remembered Rachel folding it herself, sleeves tucked in, collar smoothed flat, a small habit passed from one woman to another, without either of them ever meeting. He took it without a word, the wool still faintly warm from the dryer. Then his fingers found something tucked in the pocket, a small, folded note in Claire's handwriting, the ink slightly smudged where her hand must have hesitated. "Thank you for opening the door." He read it twice, then a third time, standing alone on the dock with the lake wind moving through the pines. After Claire had driven off to give him the space she somehow knew he needed, he sat down on the edge of the dock and let himself cry, quietly, for the first time in 4 years. Not entirely out of grief this time, but something closer to release, like a door long swollen shut had finally been eased open. She came back before nightfall, headlights sweeping across the cabin's front windows as dusk settled over the lake. "I stopped pretending before the storm ended," she said, standing in the doorway like she wasn't sure she was allowed in yet, snow melting in her hair. "I thought I was protecting you," Ethan admitted, crossing the room to meet her. "You were." She stepped inside, finally, and let the door close behind her. "Now let me protect you." He didn't have an answer for that either. He didn't need one. This time there was no audience, no reception hall, no watching family sizing him up from across a crowded room. Just the fireplace throwing gold light across the walls, and Duke asleep by the hearth, one ear twitching at the quiet, and a kiss that lasted long enough to erase every doubt either of them had carried into the room. It was quieter than the first, slower, certain in a way the first one hadn't had time to be, back when it still had an audience to answer to. This one belonged to no one but them. Spring came late to the mountain, but it came completely. The snow gave way to soft dark ground and green shoots pushing up along the fence line, and the lake shed its ice in slow, cracking sheets that Ethan liked to listen to from the dock in the evenings. Claire had planted a garden by the porch, uneven rows that she defended fiercely against Ethan's gentle teasing about her tomato spacing. She'd gotten better at cooking, marginally. She still burned the eggs sometimes, on purpose now, just to hear him laugh. Every morning, there were 2 coffee mugs on the counter, instead of one kept out of habit and never quite put away. Duke had gone a little gray around the muzzle, slower on the stairs than he used to be, but he still met Claire at the door every evening like it was the best part of his day, tail thumping against the floorboards the same way it had that first snowbound night. The cabin door still stuck a little in the cold, the same stubborn swell in the wood that Ethan had never quite gotten around to fixing. Rachel's sweater sat folded on the back of a chair, no longer an emotional landmine but simply part of the house's quiet history, worn sometimes on cold mornings without either of them making it into something it didn't need to be. The oil lantern stayed on the shelf by the door, cleaned and full, ready just in case. The fireplace still popped and settled the same way it always had, indifferent to how much had changed around it. 2 mugs, every morning, without needing to be asked. Victor was a name that came up less and less, and when it did, it had lost its weight entirely, shrunk down to nothing more than a strange chapter neither of them dwelled on. Claire's coat hung on the hook beside Ethan's, like it had always belonged there, like the house had simply been waiting for it to arrive. Another storm rolled in that evening, softer than the first one had been, more a gentle hush of snow than the howling thing that had started all of this. Ethan built up the fire out of habit rather than need, watching the flakes gather on the windowsill. A knock came at the door. Ethan was smiling before he even opened it, some part of him already recognizing the particular rhythm of her knock. Claire stood on the porch with an armful of grocery bags, snow catching in her hair and melting slowly against her cheeks. "I forgot my key," she said, laughing at herself, shifting the bags to free one hand. He stepped aside without a word, reaching to take the heaviest bag from her. "You never have to knock." She walked in past him. The same cabin, the same fireplace crackling low and steady, the same dog lifting his head from the rug to greet her with a thump of his tail against the floor. Only one thing was different now. This time, she wasn't pretending anymore. She came to my door asking for a husband until morning. She stayed long enough to make every morning after that feel like home.